Okay, we left off. Um, we left off where they were just preparing a dinner for Olaf's friends. So I'm now on page 34. Maybe somebody wants to visit us, Klaus said without much hope. In the time spent at the Baudelaire parents' death, most of the Baudelaire orphans' friends had fallen by the wayside, an expression which means they stopped calling, writing, and stopping to see any of the Baudelaires, making them very lonely. You and I, of course, would never do this to any of our grieving acquaintances, but it is the sad truth in life that when someone has lost a loved one, friends sometimes avoid the person just when the presence of friends is most needed. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny walked slowly to the front door and peered through the peephole, which was in the shape of an eye. They were delighted to see Justice Stratus peering back at them and opened the door. "Justice Stratus!" Violet cried. "How lovely to see you!" But she was about to add, "Do come in." But then she realized that Justice Stratus would probably not want to venture into the dim and dirty room. "Oh, please forgive me for not stopping by sooner," Justice Stratus said, as the Baudelaires stood awkwardly in the door. "I wanted to see how you children were settling in, but I had a very difficult case in the High Court, and it was taking up much of my time." "What sort of case was it?" Klaus asked. Having been deprived of reading, he was hungry for new information. "I can't really discuss it," Justice Stratus said, "because it's official business, but I can tell you it concerns a poisonous plant and illegal use of someone's credit card." "Yika!" Sunny shrieked, which appeared to mean, "How interesting!" Although, of course, there was no way that Sunny could understand what was being said. Justice Stratus looked down at Sunny and laughed. "Yika, indeed," she said, and reached down to pat the child on the head. Sunny took Justice Stratus' hand and bit it gently. "That means she likes you," Violet explained. "She bites very, very hard if she doesn't like you, or if she doesn't want to give her a bath." "I see," Justice Stratus said. "Now then, how are you children getting on? Is there anything you desire?" The children looked at one another, thinking of all the things they desired. Another bed, for example, a proper crib for Sunny, curtains for the window in the room, a closet instead of a cardboard box. But what they desired most of all, of course, was not to be associated with Count Olaf in any way whatsoever. What they desired most was to be with their parents again in their true home. But that, of course, was impossible. Klaus, Violet, and Sunny all looked down at the floor unhappily, as if they considered the question. Finally, Klaus spoke up. Could we perhaps borrow a cookbook?" he said. "Count Olaf has instructed us to make dinner for his theater troupe tonight, and we can't find a cookbook in the house." "Goodness!" Justice Stratus said. "Cooking dinner for an entire theater troupe seems like a lot to ask of children." "Count Olaf gives us a lot of responsibility," Violet said. What she wanted to say was, "Count Olaf is an evil man," but she was well-mannered. "Well, why don't you come next door to my house," Justice Stratus said, "and find a cookbook that pleases you?" The youngsters agreed and followed Justice Stratus out the door and over to her well-kept house. They led them through an elegant hallway smelling of flowers into an enormous room, and when they saw what was inside, they nearly fainted from delight, Klaus especially. The room was a library, not a public library, but a private library, that is, a large collection of books belonging to Justice Stratus. There were shelves and shelves of them on every wall from the floor to the ceiling, and on separate shelves and shelves of them in the middle of the room. The only place there weren't books was in the corner, where there were some large, comfortable-looking chairs and a wooden table with lamps hanging over them, perfect for the reading. Although it was not as big as their parents' library, it was as cozy, and the Baudelaire children were thrilled. "My word," Violet said. "This is a wonderful library." "Thank you very much," Justice Stratus said. "I've been collecting books for years, and I'm very proud of my collection. As long as you keep them in good condition, you are welcome to use any of my books at any time. Now, the cookbooks are over here on the eastern wall. Shall we have a look at them?" "Yes," Violet said. "And then, if you don't mind, I should love to look at any of your books concerning mechanical engineering. Inventing things is a great interest of mine." "And I would like to look at books on wolves," Klaus said. "Recently I have been fascinated by the subject of wild animals of North America." "Book!" Sunny shrieked, which meant, "Please don't forget to pick out a picture book for me." Justice Stratus smiled. "It is a pleasure to see young people interested in books," she said. "But first, I think we'd better find a good recipe, don't you?" The children agreed, and for 30 minutes or so they pursued several cookbooks that Justice Stratus recommended. To tell you the truth, the 3 orphans were so excited to be out of Count Olaf's house and in this pleasant library that they were a little distracted and unable to concentrate on cooking. But finally, Klaus found a dish that sounded delicious and easy to make. "Look at this," he said. "Puttanesca. It's an Italian sauce for pasta. All we need to do is saute olives, capers, anchovies, garlic, chopped parsley, and tomatoes together in a pot and prepare spaghetti to go with it." "That sounds easy," Violet agreed. And the Baudelaire orphans looked at one another. Perhaps with the kind Justice Stratus and her library right next door, the children would prepare pleasant lives for themselves as easily as making puttanesca sauce for Count Olaf. Chapter 4. The Baudelaire orphans copied the puttanesca recipe from the cookbook onto a piece of scrap paper, and Justice Stratus was kind enough to escort them to the market to buy the necessary ingredients. Count Olaf had not left them very much money, but the children were able to buy everything they needed. From a street vendor, they purchased olives after tasting several varieties and choosing their favorites. At a pasta store, they selected interesting-shaped noodles and asked the woman running the store the proper amount for 13 people. The 10 people Count Olaf mentioned, and the 3 of them. Then, at the supermarket, they purchased garlic, which is a sharp-tasting bulbous plant, anchovies, which are a small, salty fish, capers, which are flower buds of a small shrub and taste marvelous, and tomatoes, which are actually fruits and not vegetables, as most people believe. They thought it would be proper to serve dessert, and brought several envelopes of pudding mix. Perhaps the orphans thought, if they made a delicious meal, Count Olaf might be a bit kinder to them. "Thank you so much for helping us out today," Violet said, as she and her siblings walked home from Justice Stratus. "I don't know what we would do, what we would have done without you." "You seem like very intelligent people," Justice Stratus said. "I dare say you would have thought of something, but it continues to strike me as odd that Count Olaf has asked you to prepare such an enormous meal. Well, here we are. I must go inside and put my own groceries away. I hope you children will come over soon and borrow books from my library." "Tomorrow?" Klaus said quickly. Could we come over tomorrow?" "I don't see why not," Justice Stratus said, smiling. "I can't tell you how much we appreciate this," Violet said carefully, with her kind parents dead and Count Olaf treating them so terribly. The three children were not used to kindness from adults and weren't sure if they were expected to do anything back. Tomorrow, before we use your library again, Klaus and I would be more than happy to do household chores for you. Sunny isn't really old enough to work, but I'm sure we could find some way she can help you. Justice Stratus smiled at the three children, but her eyes were sad. She reached out a hand and put it on Violet's hair, and Violet felt more comforted than she had in some time. That won't be necessary, Justice Stratus said. You are always welcome in my home. Then she turned and went into her home, and after a moment of staring after her, the Baudelaire orphans went into theirs. For most of the afternoon, Violet, Klaus, and Sunny cooked the puttanesca sauce according to the recipe. Violet roasted the garlic and chopped the anchovies. Klaus peeled the tomatoes and pitted the olives. Sunny banged on a pot with a wooden spoon, singing a rather repetitive song she had written herself, and all three of the children felt less miserable than they had since their arrival at Count Olaf's. The smell of cooking food is often a calming one, and the kitchen grew cozy as the sauce simmered, a culinary term which means cooked over low heat. The three orphans spoke of pleasant memories of their parents and of Justice Stratus, who they agreed was a wonderful neighbor, and in whose library they planned to spend a great deal of time. As they talked, they mixed and tasted the chocolate pudding. Just as they were placing the pudding in the refrigerator to cool, Violet, Klaus, and Sunny heard a loud booming sound as the front door was flung open. And I'm sure I don't have to tell you who was home. Orphans? Count Olaf called out in his scratchy voice. Where are you, orphans? In the kitchen, Count Olaf, Klaus called. We're just finishing dinner. You better be, Count Olaf said, and strode into the kitchen. He gazed at the three Baudelaire children in his shiny, shiny eyes. My troop is right behind me and are very hungry. Where is the roast beef? We didn't make roast beef, Violet said. We made puttanesca sauce. What? Count Olaf asked. No roast beef? You didn't tell us you wanted roast beef, Klaus said. Count Olaf slid toward the children so that he looked even taller than he was. His eyes grew even brighter, and one of his eyebrows raised in anger. In agreeing to adopt you, he said, I have become your father, and as your father, I am not someone to be trifled with. I demand that you serve roast beef to myself and my guests. We don't have any, Violet cried. We made puttanesca sauce. No, Sunny shouted. Count Olaf looked down at Sunny, who had spoken so suddenly. With an inhuman roar, he picked her up in one scraggly hand and raised her so she was staring at him in the eye. Needless to say, Sunny was frightened and began crying immediately, too scared to even try to bite down the hand that held her. Put her down immediately, you beast, Klaus shouted. He jumped up, trying to rescue Klaus from the grasp of the Count, but he was holding her too high to reach. Count Olaf looked down at Klaus and smiled a terrible toothy grin, raising the wailing Sunny up even higher in the air. He seemed about to drop her to the floor when there was a large burst of laughter in the next room. Olaf! Where's Olaf? Voices called out. Count Olaf paused, still holding the wailing Sunny up in the air. As the members of his theater troupe walked into the kitchen, soon they were crowding the room, an assortment of strange-looking characters of all shapes and sizes. There was a bald man with a very long nose, dressed in a long black robe. There were two women who were bright white powder all over their faces, making them look like ghosts. Behind the woman was a man with very long and skinny arms. at the end of which were two hooks instead of hands. There was a person who was extremely fat and looked like neither a man nor a woman, and behind this person, standing in the doorway, was an assortment of people the children could not see, but promised to be just as frightening. "Here you are, Olaf," said one of the white-faced women. "And what in the world are you doing?" "I'm just disciplining these orphans," Count Olaf said. "I asked them to make dinner, and all they have made is this disgusting sauce." "You can't go easy on children," the man with the hook hand said. "They must be taught to obey their elders." The tall, bald man peered at the youngsters. "Are these," he said to Count Olaf, "those wealthy children you were telling me about?" "Yes," Count Olaf said. "They are so awful I can scarcely stand to touch them." With that, he lowered Sunny, who was still wailing, to the floor. Violet and Klaus breathed a sigh of relief that he had not dropped her from that great height. "I don't blame you," said someone in the doorway. Count Olaf rubbed his hands together as if he had been holding something revolting instead of an infant. "Well, enough talk," he said. "I suppose we will eat their dinner even though it is all wrong. Everyone, follow me to the dining room. I will pour us some wine. Perhaps by the time these brats serve us, we won't be too drunk to care if it is roast beef or not." "Hurrah!" cried several members of the troop, and they marched through the kitchen, following Count Olaf into the dining room. Nobody paid a bit of attention to the children except for the bald man, who stopped and stared Violet in the eye. "You're a pretty one," he said, taking her face into his rough hands. "If I were you, I would try not to anger Count Olaf, for he might wreck that pretty little face of yours." Violet shrugged, and the bald man gave a high-pitched giggle and left the room. The Baudelaire children, alone in the kitchen, found themselves breathing heavily as if they had just run a long distance. Sunny continued to wail, and Klaus found that his eyes were wet with tears as well. Only Violet didn't cry, but merely trembled with fear and revulsion, a word here which means an unpleasant mixture of horror and disgust. For several moments, none of them could speak. Okay, that is where I am going to stop today. So if you want the points for Oregon Trail, go ahead and draw me a picture and write me a couple sentences on what you think is going to happen next.